So Tom Barkin has nearly 3 decades of experience with McKinsey & Company. He has particular expertise and experience in financial services, having served on global banks, property and casualty insurers, brokerages, and money managers extensively. He also serves on McKinsey's board and operating committee and is chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. Please join me in first welcoming Jack Klink to the stage.
Great, thanks, Rima. Well, thank you and good morning. It's terrific to be here. I'm not going to be able to be disruptive this morning with a camera, but hopefully I'll be able to challenge you in some new ways as we think about big data and analytics. As Rimi mentioned, I'm not a CFO, but that's why I have Tom along with me to help out. I have run a lot of businesses. I've spent a lot of time with our CFO, and I think I have some insights that would be valuable as I share with you this morning. So with that context, what I'd like to do this morning is emphasize to you how data and analytics can truly be disruptive and how, as CFOs, you can play a uniquely valuable role in your organizations to help create business value out of that topic. So let's get started. I'm going to cover a couple of things pretty quickly and try to tie it back to your roles. I'll also talk a little bit about our business and how we saw that coming into shape, just to give you an idea of how one big company thinks about data and analytics. And then Tom will come up to the stage, as Rimi mentioned. He'll chat for a few minutes, and then we really hope to get into a dialogue. So in the spirit of our last speaker, be thinking about some questions you can ask us as well, because we'd certainly like to have your viewpoints this morning. So let's start with this. I'm sure many of you feel, as I do, and as these people sitting around the table, that we're really becoming overwhelmed with more data. Big data sometimes gets confused with more data. And as this cartoon illustrates, it's really not about more. It's about trying to figure out how we move forward. And that's how analytics and data can work together, and what I'll try to share with you this morning. So as our access to data expands, so must our ability to analyze it and make sense of it. And herein lies the great paradox. More data requires more focus. And I would suggest, in the spirit of Hal's talk, that one way to get focus is by asking the right questions. So let's start with a definition. This is a topic that's relatively new. I bet if I asked each of you to pull out a pen and paper and write down your own definition of big data and analytics, we'd have a wide variety of responses. So I'd like to offer how I think about this topic and at least put a stake in the ground for you to consider. This is a definition from Merriam-Webster. I won't read it to you, but it's a pretty straightforward definition in terms of how big data, which has just now come into their dictionary in the last couple of years. But the way I like to think about it is in 3 concentric circles. The first is volume. There's just more access, more data being produced every day. And there's a number of statistics out there from IBM and others to just talk about the amount of data that's created on a daily basis and how that continues to dwarf the data from the day before. The second is variety. And variety means a lot of different things. It's not just structured data that comes off the general ledger, for example. It could be unstructured data coming from a variety of different sources, both from inside and from outside of your organization. And then there's velocity, certainly speed in terms of how data comes at us. It's not just in the batch cycle that ran last night. It's real time coming at us 24/7. So let's pair that with advanced analytics. And how do we think about that? I borrowed a definition from Tom here to think about this question. It's really using tools and techniques that probably none of us learned in business school to get at some of these answers. It's a lot more than just reporting and analysis and looking backwards into the data or into the financials. It's a lot more about what's on the right-hand edge of this chart, which is monitoring, predictive, and prescriptive analytics. This gets at tools such as neural networks, nonlinear statistical modeling, text analysis, sentiment analysis, and artificial intelligence would certainly fall into this category as well. So no surprise, big data has been labeled as a very disruptive technology. And it's certainly getting a lot of media coverage, not just in the trades or the technical press, but also in the general press. 8 years ago, Business Week ran a cover story titled, "How Math Will Rock Your World." And I think we're absolutely seeing that now. So what makes big data and advanced analytics so disruptive? Well, I think there are a number of things. One is it can really be a new source of value to customers, how we think about innovation and launching new products. It's certainly an ability to create competitive advantage, to get there first, to use data in a way to understand your customer better than one of your competitors, particularly in those businesses such as banking, where there's a lot of commoditization and margin erosion. Better insights into behaviors. Think of all those surveys that you take when you step off an airplane or you check out of a hotel. I get probably 3 to 4 survey requests a day. All that data is captured and fed back into someone at those organizations who are trying to monitor and predict my behavior and what's going to happen the next time I stay with them or fly with them. So being able to use data to be more predictive is another key way to make this topic disruptive. So with all of this attention, how much is hype and how much is reality? What I've done here is borrow from Gartner. You're familiar with the Gartner Research House. They've been reviewing emerging technologies for years, and specifically looking at those technologies which have high impact potential and have really transformed an industry. This is a simple graph to show how a life cycle works of a new idea, starting on the left, moving to the right. The innovation trigger, that's where the idea is born. The peak of inflated expectations is when the hype really gets ahead of the reality. And it's interesting to note that in this particular column on the chart, there's only one business model that generates profits, and that's conferences. So congratulations to Jack and Jeremy for bringing us here today, because certainly you're working well. The next 3 columns really talk about the fall off, or the third column, I should say, talks about the fall off as we get back to reality, and then ultimately the business models start to take shape. So let's plot a couple of business models here that you can see. Some of these I'm sure you're very familiar with. 3D printing over on the right-hand side, for example. Speech recognition, you might know this as Siri, or now it's State Street. If you have a problem logging into your PC in the morning when you come to work, we actually use speech recognition with the help desk to identify you and help answer your problem. So these are really becoming more mainstream. But where does big data and analytics sit? All 3 sit right now in the peak of inflated expectations. Business models are somewhat proven, but not entirely proven. The media is probably ahead of us in terms of what we're doing here. Gartner predicts that in the next 2 to 5 years, these red dots are going to move quickly to the right, into the trough of disillusionment, and then certainly into the slope of enlightenment and the plateau of productivity. So keep your eyes open for that. You might look at this chart and say, is it too early to get started? Should I just wait a little bit, let these products mature, let the technology perhaps become a little less expensive? You could certainly take that approach, but I would certainly argue no. That it's often the early adopters, not necessarily the first, but the early adopters who can get in and figure this out and acquire scale early on in the game are the winners. Think about Google with search, or eBay with auctions, or Facebook with social media. They weren't necessarily the first, but they got there early, they figured it out, and they built huge customer bases that were tremendous barriers to entry. So it does mean that expectations can get ahead of reality. And I'm sure as CFOs, listening to business heads come in your office, you've heard that before. You've seen all that optimism. That's certainly true in this case as well. But there are ways to take this forward. Let me talk a little bit about the investment that's occurring, because companies are starting to pour a ton of money into this space. You can see here, hopefully, just the amount of data that's climbing sharply. I referenced this earlier. How does this data get stored? How do you manage it? Just pure data management issues continued to plague our industry. You think about transaction data in the credit card space, for example, or the retail banking space. All of those transactions getting captured every day. How do we pay for storage? How do we understand what's inside of those transactions to be better business people? IDC has estimated that the digital universe generated 4.4 zettabytes of data last year. Now, I'm not sure what a zettabyte is. I'm sure someone at MIT probably invented that term. But last year, that's how much was generated. They're now predicting that that amount's going to continue to double every year for the next 20 years, getting us to 44 zettabytes by 2020. So we've got some big storage issues ahead of us for sure. How are companies responding? Well, in the research that IDC has done, just under half have formal efforts underway to look at this topic. And they're spending on average $8 million a year. Now, these are dangerous statistics. They're averages, big standard deviations. A lot of companies are doing a lot more, and a lot of companies aren't doing anything, so I'm reluctant to talk about averages. But it does at least show that half the companies are really actively thinking about this. They're asking the questions about what their value proposition is going to be in this space. Do they have the right people to think about it going forward? A number of organizations are very limited by their employees and their ability to think creatively and also technically about this issue. So you may recall last year when I was here, I made a comment that many of you buzzed back to me on later in the day, later in the week, and that was that State Street last year hired more engineers than MBAs. Well, that's certainly true this year again. The skill sets and the DNA, and we can get into this in the Q&A if you'd like, the cultural aspects of this are significant and certainly not to be overlooked. I'd like to walk you through a few other data points, some of which are your own. But before I do that, in May, the MIT Sloan School in their management review wrote an article about this topic. And they went out and they surveyed 2,000 people, and they interviewed over 30 executives. And this is what they found. They tried to bucket those survey responders into these three categories. Analytically challenged, about a third. Analytical practitioners, about half. And then analytical innovators, about 12%. So you can see sort of the continuum. Again, this is self-ratings in terms of how people felt about their roles in their organizations and how they were doing. Now, a few weeks ago, we had the opportunity to go out to a group of you with an online survey. And I thought we'd do a little compare and contrast as to this audience versus the 2,000 individuals who participated last May. The red triangles represent the responses in this group. So we've got a really highly enlightened group here today. So I'm expecting some tremendous questions, a lot of overachievers. Now, granted, there could be a lot of selection bias in these statistics, but nevertheless, I think people really are waking up to the power of big data and advanced analytics. They're starting to think about it a lot more deeply, and it's occurring really across the board, across the globe, across industries, across large companies, and across small companies. Let me just talk a little bit about the analytical innovators, since many of you here in the room are in that category. They're characterized by what I would say 4 defining traits. You have a culture and a comfort level around analytics, and so does your management team. You think about it strategically, not tactically. You place a high value on the data as a source of the truth. And you have higher levels and more comfort with your own skill in playing with the data. Now, maybe that, again, is the selection bias of a CFO. By virtue of you being here today, you actually are already in the data and analytics space. It's a natural place for you to extend and lead these efforts within your organizations. So let me talk about that a little bit more as I've thought about the unique opportunity that each of you have. You're traditionally trusted with this type of topic, this type of information, to provide data and insight for better decision-making around the table. Certainly that will continue. You understand and know how to protect an asset. This is an asset. It may not sit directly on your balance sheet, but it is an asset waiting to be harvested. You currently lead key management processes around data, looking at information, getting to one source of the truth. And typically, CFOs have a variety of other functions that may be closely related or even part of the CFO's office around risk and compliance and technology, all of which very much tie in. So I would say to you that the office of the CFO is the natural place for these activities to get started. We have a long way to go, but it's a good place to get started. Let me just share a little bit more about how you might think about a roadmap on that journey. Gathering the data. Where is it coming from? How do you harness it? How do you store it? What tools are being used to apply against the data? How do you think about making better decisions? Being able to challenge. And of course, speed and nimbleness as the market continues to innovate very rapidly. I mean, ultimately, what this all boils down to is something that you're all familiar with, and that's value creation. Using data and analytics to drive value creation in your organizations. That's what it's got to be tied back to. That's where the focus comes from, and Hal's comment about asking the right questions all tie back into this going forward. There are important decisions to be made every day about allocation of capital, allocation of staff, and leveraging a lot of these tools and techniques. No doubt you're going to make much better business decisions. So let me just take one slide and talk to you a little bit about my own experience at State Street, because this, in essence, is how we've chosen to be disruptive. We're actually in the data space. I like to think that State Street is a data company trapped inside a bank. I'm not so sure the Fed would like that characterization, but that's how I like to think of ourselves, because it sets the right tone. As a custody bank, we have $28 trillion of assets that flow through the plumbing of our company every day. That's 12% of the world's assets that somehow State Street is touching every day. It's a global business, half in the US, half outside the US. So talk about a statistically significant sample size. I mean, we have a huge treasure chest of data. Some of it's our data, some of it's our clients' data. How can we leverage this to not only help ourselves, but more importantly, how can we leverage it to help our clients make better decisions? Many of our clients are fund managers. Hedge fund managers, long-only managers, what are they trying to do? Right? They're trying to beat their benchmark. They're trying to generate alpha. They're trying to have great investment returns. Imagine if we can help them with better tools in the front office, better trading techniques, particularly in this day of front running. Think about risk and compliance. Our whole industry was plagued in 2008 with risk and compliance issues. We didn't have the right information. We didn't know what to do with it. Certainly the tools and techniques that are out there now are going to allow much better decisions around risk to be made, as well as compliance with laws and rules. So we started a business. We thought we could get at this incrementally. We tried for a year or two. We weren't happy with the progress. Our CEO was bold enough to say, this really represents the future of the company. We're not going to continue to get paid for processing transactions. Those costs are getting driven to zero with automation. But we can get paid for insights and for ideas. So we started a business unit. We grabbed a number of people and products that were sprinkled around the organization, each trying to go at this in a very incremental and fragmented way. And we formed a new business unit, put somebody in charge of it, and said, figure it out. The other thing we did was we didn't all, on day one, come out to the Newton Marriott and have an offsite to form the strategy of this business. We recognized that we were going to learn our way into the strategy. We were going to iterate. I think this is a lot more like science than it is business. And when I like to describe what we do, I like to use analogies with the pharmaceutical industry. We're not wearing white lab coats, but we're in the lab. We're trying, we're testing, we're learning. And from the failures, we also learn. So at State Street, failure is not a good thing. But we have to be comfortable that an idea will fail as separate from an individual will fail. So we're experimenting a lot. We have some ideas around strategy. We have a vision. We know generally the way where we want to go, but we just don't know what the roadmap is. Is the next turn to the right or to the left? We need to be comfortable with that amount of ambiguity, There needs to be some ambiguity in this process. You can't just simply go off-site and think you've got it figured out, come back home, and tell somebody to execute. You've got to be comfortable that there's going to be a lot of learnings, a lot of failures, but ultimately you'll start to get there and you'll feel that momentum start to build. So what I'd like to do now is turn it over to Tom to talk about his experiences, which I think really provide two distinct viewpoints this morning. One is Tom's a CFO, right? So he's sitting in your seat. He knows what it's like running a big global complex company. But Tom also spends half of his time out with clients, talking to CFOs and CEOs. So he's got a unique perspective. So I'd like Tom to come up and share a few remarks, and then we'll get into a Q&A. Tom?
The other unique vantage point I have is that our organization has 9,500 consultants, and every one of them thinks they know how to do what I do better than I do. I start with some natural skepticism on the whole conversation about big data. In 2009, I took my role. The world was in turmoil, and we had lots of questions about how many people we should hire, given that demand was uncertain. A lot of our consultants thought this is the perfect moment for big data. What you do is you take all the information you could possibly get, you put it all together, and somehow magically we will predict what demand will be 18 months from now for a product we have where the longest study is about 3 months. Okay, and we worked that and worked that and worked that, and frankly, there's no good answer there. You can't predict long-term demand of a short-term product in a world that's massively uncertain. Or put differently, big data doesn't solve everything. Okay? But I did think what I'd do is spend a little time talking about what it could do. And just try to give 8 pretty practical ideas on where we're seeing and where our clients are seeing real value from big data and advanced analytics. And just give you some examples and hope that it sparks a few thoughts. We're seeing real applications in forecasting. And so my example aside, we're seeing a lot of people use wisdom of crowds, crowdsourcing, to get real value in understanding what demand will be for new products or for their products in general. Polling sales forces and having them vote at places like Chibo, Henkel as being incredibly helpful. So there is real value in forecasting if you can get the horizon right and get the input right. We're seeing real value in working capital optimization. I was talking to a friend of mine who works for the Weather Channel. Their commercial business is going through the roof. And the reason it's going through the roof is that everywhere in the world, businesses are saying, if I can get really good weather information, by the way, it's getting increasingly good, I can put those into things like retail production planning and get a much better sense of how to get the right product to the right store in the right time. So working capital optimization, there's a lot that's being done with big data. We're seeing a lot in capital and resource allocation. If you think about how a bank chose to open branches even 10 or 15 years ago, it was a pretty simple model. Today, they're in a very sophisticated model of trying to predict revenue in the branch and then using that data to actually monitor how the branch is doing. And so capital is being put into assets in a very different pace, in a very different way, because people can do a much better job of trying to understand the true drivers and the true dynamics. We're seeing a lot in revenue maximization. If you go onto an airline website, you may notice they've actually gotten really good at understanding where you're searching, what you're doing, and coming back with offers. One of the airlines I know works on what they call emerging high-value customers, the people that we hire in New York or Boston who would have absolutely no record of being a high-value customer except the day after they start, they're traveling all the time. How do we get offers in their hands? How do we give them pre-check? All those kind of things are happening, and it's all being enabled by their confidence that they can use multiple sources of data to try to find opportunities and then hit target offers to those customers. So we're seeing it in revenue maximization. We're seeing it in risk management. The banks are using today a massively different set of data to make credit risk decisions. They're using a massively different set of data to do loss forecasting, length of relationship. They're accessing social media. There's been a lot more focus on this, and the quality of these models and the quality of these analysis has tripled in the last 5 years. So we're seeing lots of applications in risk management. We're seeing it in cost management or even expense management. Our consultants are on the road. They file expense reports. We've actually developed an algorithm to try to understand those who might be filing improper expense reports. And it's actually pretty powerful. When the algorithm comes through and the reports come up, you know the guys who are being fraudulent, right? Credit cards are doing the same thing. If you focus on, I was in Brazil a couple weeks ago, made a charge in Brazil. The next day I got a call asking whether that was fraudulent. These guys really have developed some algorithms, and they're using it to do a pretty sophisticated job in cost management. We're seeing it in human capital management. We've actually got a turnover algorithm now to try to predict which people are at risk of turning over. You can look at their satisfaction from a survey standpoint. You can look at their staffing experience. You can look at their mentorship. You can look at how close they were to someone who departed recently. But if turnover matters in your institution, or if hiring matters, people are really using advanced analytics to get to a much higher plane there. And then finally, visualization and transparency. Airlines now have little sensors in the engines to monitor fuel burn, so they know engine by engine which ones are operating well and which ones aren't. P&G has a weekly conversation where they're getting data, market data from all over the world. Stuff that used to be done monthly is now being looked at weekly. And they're finding real opportunities to bring big data analytics to get visualization, transparency into performance faster. So I would just say those are 8 quick examples. Big data is a great catchphrase, but also suggests it's a very practical tool for folks to use to drive impact. And what Jack and I will do now is probably ask ourselves a couple questions and then open it up to the floor.
Okay, Tom. Let me ask you a couple questions. Let me start with your observations as you travel, you spend time with CFOs. What types of different leadership roles do you see CFOs taking in this space? And if they aren't taking those roles, what might be some of the barriers that are preventing them from moving forward?
Well, I mean, you said this earlier, but it's pretty obvious to me that a CFO has a natural role in this space. You set the agenda in terms of what ought to be a priority for an individual business unit or line of or staff function. You fund the agenda, and by the way, measure the impact of the stuff that's not working. So you have the talent. It feels perfectly obvious to me you ought to have a role. Of course, a lot of the impact you have here is in the businesses, and so the challenge is about how do you get access to the role, right? And I think different companies have very different dynamics on that. In some, the CFO naturally steps up, everyone appoints. But in other businesses, you've got executives who also have an interest. And I guess I just think at its simplest, the data, its quality, its consistency, its credibility, that's yours, right? And I can't imagine any reason why you wouldn't be in the middle of the conversation. And then I think you put the budgeting, funding, measurement piece together, you absolutely ought to be at the table on each and every application.
So if a CFO or a company hasn't yet embarked into this space, do you have any tips or shortcuts or ideas about where there might be a good entry point? It's such a big space. You could come at it from so many different perspectives. What might be the best place to begin the journey?
So I think there are 2 types of companies, or maybe you're both, maybe State Street's both. Companies that have a lot of data that might find ways to monetize it, market it, leverage it, right? And that's a business proposition. Or companies that have a lot of data and want to use it to improve their own operation. I think those are 2 very different things. What I've been struck by is how many companies are in year 3 of trying to clean up the data and aren't yet ready to use it. And I just encourage you to get started. I mean, the airline example I gave you, their data's a mess. On the other hand, it's not that hard to find 20,000 people who just moved to Boston to take jobs with banks, consulting firms, asset managers who are going to be traveling, who are going to be airline people, and come up with an offer to give them and measure success. So to me, it's about getting started, because I think if you can get started and measure it, it'll fund itself, and otherwise you'll just get stuck. One for you. I mean,
Sure.
you built a business in an established business that had its own cultural behaviors and embedded barriers and mindsets. What did you have to break to try to get successful at State Street?
We had to break, I'd say, a number of molds at State Street. One was around the DNA of the individuals, thinking about our historical DNA, very technology-driven, but also very financially driven, very linear, very business school driven. We had to really think about business and technology being vested in one person. The old paradigm of the business people come up with the idea, the technology people build it. I think that's gone. I think there's now a blurring of those lines, and we needed technology people who could think about business problems and business people who could think about technology. Not necessarily coding, but there are certain business schools I'm aware of that are actually thinking about requiring a semester of coding as part of their 2-year program. So I think there's just a huge convergence. We've tried to identify those people, either newly out of school or people that maybe fit in one of those two camps, but put them together, tie their goals together, tie their incentive together to make that work. The other mold we had to break was around financial reporting, and this is where we had to really deal with the CFO. You can't use the same measurement system for a new business in this space that you use for a traditional or a legacy business. You can't just look at revenue, expenses, and profit. There needs to be other types of, in addition, I would say, other types of metrics to sort of determine whether or not you're being successful. And this is well written in a lot of the books around innovation, whether it's new customer acquisition, retention. One of the things that's in my goals for this year is not just the number of prototypes that I was able to bring to market as part of this business, because that's just measuring the successes, but also the number of experiments that we conducted. So getting our CEO to think, okay, don't just tell me about all the things that worked, because I don't really know at the beginning of the year how many of these things are going to work. So to pick a number is really just putting my finger up in the air. But hold me accountable to make sure that I at least run enough experiments so that I at least know that out of a large number, there's going to be some smaller number that actually are going to work. So thinking about very different goals and metrics, not just a traditional, in our case, a 200-year-old bank. You know, we have very traditional metrics for most of our businesses. So being able to carve out a few people at the table and say, you know what, we're going to hold you accountable to these other things. We've got a lot of existing businesses. We'll let them worry about profitability and earnings per share and margin. You worry about stuff that's going to hit in a couple of years. And here are some ways we can measure your success. Why don't we open it up at the moment and see if we've got anything from the floor. I think I can see in the lights. Do we have any questions? We've got some microphones going around, so why don't we get those in your hands and we'll take your questions. You can address them to either or both of us.
Loan student walks towards you and hands you the microphone. Please say your name and the company you work with. And as Hal said, ask the question, not the preamble to the question.
Hi, my name is. Hi, my name is Dennis Ringland. I'm with the sister organization, the MITC IO Symposium. My question is, Jack, you talked about having to live with ambiguity, companies living with ambiguity as they start going down the path of big data and analytics. The trialing, the testing, the failing. We hear that a lot about companies allowing for failure. Can you just add a little bit more in terms of what you may be seeing around organizations allowing for the costs of this failure and doing more and more experimentation to get deeper and deeper into the analytics they need to get into?
Sure. That's a good question. I mean, there's certainly a cost to run experiments, to pay the people to be able to try to find what's going to be the winner in the marketplace. One of the things that we've done within our business is it's a large swath of space. So we've actually cataloged or categorized these efforts into 3 buckets. The first would be the more mature products, and we have some actually, believe it or not, some mature data products. We manage those more for the margin and the growth. Then we have a portfolio of what I would call emerging. These are products that are new, they've come off the launch pad, they might have been just out in the market, coming out of pilot. And then the first bucket, going in reverse order of the life cycle, would be what I call the innovation portfolio. And the innovation portfolio is really where a lot of the testing and experimentation comes in. So there's a tendency always, certainly in big companies when times get tough, to cut the marketing budget, to cut back on hiring, and to cut things that may not have as quick a payback. Looking through a payback lens of what's going to generate shareholder return first, keep those things sacred, and the things that we're less sure of and aren't going to, and maybe we don't know if they're going to even be successful, let's go after that budget. So I've had to put a really big fence around that innovation portfolio bucket. And when times get tight, I have to rally the team and rally my boss to avoid the temptation to go after that bucket, because that's the future. And we need to make sure that we protect it, because it also sends a really tough signal to the staff if we're dipping in and out of that budget, increasing it one day, lowering it the next day. It's not that dynamic. These experiments take a lot of time to run. We typically need client permission to use certain data. We need to get their feedback. We need to improve it. There's a lot of work. It's not just here today, stop tomorrow. So that's one thing I've done, is really tried to protect that budget and try to pull other levers if I have to make a certain number.
Hi.
A couple, yes.
Yes. Craig Martin with the Association for Financial Professionals, and this question's for Tom. You mentioned in risk management, you talked about different data being used now. What do you mean by different data?
So if you go back in the mid-2000s, which I would not suggest was the highlight of risk management for banks, a lot of lending was done on credit score and not much more than that. A lot of forecasting was done based on the trend in the current book and not much more than that. If you look at it today, they're bringing in a lot more data. They're bringing in bank relationship data. So how long have you been with the bank? How many accounts do you have? Those things have statistically been shown to be correlated with better loss performance. Those are brought into the system. And they're bringing in data from outside of the bank, not just the classic stuff of income and zip code, but where you are on social media. They're actually sometimes checking some of that stuff, right? And they're trying to bring in as much information as they can to try to make better decisions. And I just think in most of these places, they took more stagnant organizations and have started to embed data and ask the question. It's no different than you'd see in the statistical things you're seeing in sports these days. How do we make better decisions with better information?
One example I could also offer to tag on to that is a hedge fund client that I'm working with. They tend to be in the long-short equity space. So they're trying to pick stocks that are going to be winners and buy them and short the stocks that they think they're going to fall. And they have a lot of traditional research methods. One of the newer research methods is called sentiment analysis. Mm-hmm. So they're partnering with a company that we're doing some work with. They give them a list of the securities that they're following, and that company every day is checking all the social media and all headlines in newspapers. So let's pick State Street. Every time State Street is mentioned, they try to figure out with their algorithms if it's in a positive or a negative context. Is State Street in the headlines because we did something wrong, or maybe because we got a new business win? They try to put some positive or negative sentiment around the name of that company, and they actually create a continuum or a score based on that. That gets fed back into the investment process, and the fund manager uses that information to help decide whether or not he wants to buy or short that security. Another question, we had one here, kind of up in the front. Right here.
It appears big data is naturally suited for large businesses. How would small and medium-sized businesses use big data?
One would be an effort to become big businesses. I don't see anything exclusionary to deal with size of businesses. In fact, I guess my strong bias would be, no offense, the larger the company, the harder it is to get focused on a new initiative. I think the smaller and mid-sized companies have a lot more opportunity to move on a dime and get there. So I think it's very doable. The cost of data is down, the availability of data is up. I think the most interesting companies in big data are actually small and medium companies.
Okay, we have time for one more. Yes, over here? Yep. Keep your hand up and they'll come find you. No, to your left.
Thank you. Lauren Kelly from OpEx Engine. You mentioned that big data is contributing to better forecasts, and it's clear, I think, in subscription businesses how that works, because it's easier to forecast because you have committed revenue and you can apply information about renewals. But What about other businesses that are not subscription businesses? Do you see better forecasting, and how does that work?
Yeah, I can give an example. Maybe, Tom, you have one too. We have a foreign exchange trading business, and every day you start the day at zero, and you have to go out to your customers and get them to trade with you. They probably have 10 different banks they could trade foreign exchange with every day, so there's no degree at all of recurring revenue in that business. So you got to start from scratch every morning. So we use a lot of different tools from our sales force and our people in the market to try to evaluate demand. We're assigning, for example, different probabilities around their relationships and their likelihood to trade with us. We're looking, if they'll give it to us, where we fall in the stack order of their trading partners. Are we one of their top 2 or 3, or are we in the bottom quartile? So we're trying to take different types of information that they give us, and then we actually correlate it and go back and look at it with the behavior of the day before. So we're able to get some degree of demand. We also know that certain clients tend to trade during periods of high volatility, but if it gets too high, they might step out of the market and wait, and we know which clients they are because, again, we can look at their behavior. So that allows us to, for example, just understand the type of day we might have, types of staffing decisions. Do we need to keep the desk in London open longer, before the Tokyo desk opens, for example, and how we move foreign exchange trading around the world. So we're very young at this, but we're starting to at least become a little smarter about how we think about that business, and that's one that's really at the opposite end of recurring revenue.
And I would just say it's not a panacea, but people are really digging into this. I described how ours didn't work all that well, but I think there are real opportunities in Salesforce polling, getting that the right way, folks closest to the market, what might happen with new product launches, what's going to happen with sales. People are doing some very interesting things there.
Great. Well, thank you very much.